Jack pushed through the glass doors of Hale's Burgers on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the heavy scent of frying oil clinging to the air. He stopped. A muffled sob had slipped from behind the counter. The cashier, Maria, swiped at her eyes and forced a brittle smile as the next customer stepped forward, her shoulders trembling. Jack tugged the brim of his worn cap lower, scanning the room. The place was full trays clattering, oil hissing, registers beeping, but the air felt wrong, stripped of chatter and laughter. A door banged open. Mark Dawson emerged, eyes sweeping the dining room with predatory calm. Maria's fingers shook under his glare. Jack said nothing, only watched, storing every detail. The sharp bark of orders, the subtle dismissals, the way discrimination slipped by unnoticed. Each moment slotted into memory like evidence, forming a picture that was darker than grease and far harder to wash away. The lunch rush swirled around him. Construction workers grabbing quick meals, office employees on their break, families with children who reminded him of his own youth in Detroit. Nobody noticed the black man in work clothes and scuffed boots, just another face in the crowd. Jack had spent decades learning to blend in, to make others comfortable with his presence, but today invisibility served a different purpose. Maria's red-rimmed eyes met his briefly as she called out order numbers, and something in her expression, fear mixed with resignation, made his jaw clench. This wasn't just about profit margins or corporate policies. This was about people like him, like her, like everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Jack joined the line behind a group of oil field workers, their hard hats caked with dried mud. The man ahead of him, a supervisor by the look of his cleaner uniform, was complaining loudly about the wait. "These people don't know how to work," he declared to his companion. "No hustle, no pride. That's the problem with this neighborhood." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd heard variations of this speech his entire life, from boardrooms to construction sites to his own restaurants. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was standing in a business he owned, listening to customers disparage workers whose wages he ultimately controlled. Mark Dawson emerged from the back office, his manager's polo stretched tight across his gut, and Jack's attention sharpened. This was the man who'd been the subject of 17 formal complaints in 6 months. Complaints that had somehow never made it past the regional office. Mark's eyes swept the dining room with the calculating gaze of a predator, lingering on the Latino family in the corner booth before settling on Maria with obvious irritation. "Maria!" Mark's voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife. "Why is that order taking so long?" "Move faster." The young woman's hands shook as she fumbled with the register, her voice barely audible as she apologized. Jack watched the interaction with the detached focus of a detective gathering evidence, but beneath his calm exterior, anger simmered like oil in a hot pan. When Mark's gaze swept over Jack, there was a moment of assessment, a quick cataloging of worn clothes, dark skin, and working man's posture. The dismissal was instant and complete, the kind of casual dehumanization that Jack had encountered countless times, but never quite gotten used to. In boardrooms, he commanded respect through reputation and authority. Here, stripped of those markers, he was just another black man in a world that had already decided his worth. The line moved with agonizing slowness, each minute revealing new layers of dysfunction. Jack observed Mark ignore 3 customers of color while immediately attending to white patrons, watched him pocket tips left on the counter, noted the way younger employees flinched when he passed. This wasn't incompetence, it was systematic oppression dressed up as management. When Jack finally reached the counter, Maria's smile was a masterpiece of practiced deception. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in her features, the way her hands trembled slightly as she waited for his order. She was maybe 22, with the kind of quiet dignity that reminded him of his own mother, who'd cleaned office buildings at night to pay for his college. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice carried a slight accent that Mark had probably mocked behind her back. Jack kept his own voice level, professional. "I'll take a double cheeseburger combo, medium fries, Coke." As Maria rang up his order, Mark appeared beside her like a shark, sensing blood in the water. His eyes fixed on Jack with undisguised hostility, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular tone of authority wielded by small men in small positions of power. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your payment method before we prepare your order." The request hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Jack glanced around the restaurant. No one else had been asked for prepayment. The white businessman who'd ordered ahead of him had been handed his receipt without question. The subtlety of the discrimination was almost artistic in its cruelty. "I'll pay when the order's ready," Jack replied calmly. Mark's smile was thin and cold. Company policy. Cash customers pay first. He gestured vaguely at a sign that Jack knew didn't exist, had never existed in any Halesburger's policy manual he'd approved. Jack reached into his wallet and placed a 20 on the counter with deliberate precision. The bill was crisp, new, clearly legitimate currency, but Mark examined it like he was searching for evidence of forgery. Maria's discomfort was palpable as she completed the transaction, her movements quick and nervous. "Your order will be ready in a few minutes," she said softly, handing him the receipt. Jack nodded and moved to the waiting area, watching as Mark's attention immediately shifted to the next customer, a white woman who was greeted with professional courtesy and no request for prepayment. The double standard was so blatant it took his breath away, but he forced himself to remain still, to observe and document rather than react. The dining room buzzed with conversation, but Jack felt isolated in a bubble of growing tension. He pulled out his phone and began typing notes in what appeared to be a text message, but was actually documentation for the legal case he was already building in his mind. Employee intimidation, discriminatory payment policies, theft of customer tips. The list grew longer with each passing minute. When his order number was called, Jack approached the counter to find Mark holding the bag instead of Maria. The manager's smile was sharp-edged and dangerous, the kind of expression that promised trouble. "Enjoy your meal," Mark said, but his tone suggested the opposite. "And maybe next time you could find somewhere more suited to your budget?" The insult was delivered with surgical precision, quiet enough to avoid attracting attention, but loud enough for Jack to hear clearly. Around them, the restaurant continued its chaotic dance of commerce and hunger, but for Jack, the moment crystallized into something harder and more focused than rage. He accepted the bag without comment, his expression giving nothing away. But as he turned to leave, he spoke just loud enough for Mark to hear. "Thank you. I'll be sure to remember this experience." There was something in his tone that made Mark's confident smirk falter for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested some primitive instinct was warning him that he'd just made a mistake. But the moment passed, and Mark's arrogance reasserted itself like a toxin in the bloodstream. Jack walked to his rented Toyota Camry in the parking lot, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the untouched burger growing cold in his lap as he stared back at the restaurant through the windshield. The neon sign blazed against the gray Houston sky. Hale's Burgers, America's hometown flavor. He'd built this empire on the promise of opportunity and dignity for all workers, regardless of background. Watching that promise being corrupted by men like Mark Dawson felt like watching his own children being poisoned. Jack reached for his phone and scrolled to a contact labeled Sarah Williams, COO. His finger hovered over the call button for a moment before he closed the phone and started the engine instead. Tomorrow, he would return. But tonight, he needed to prepare for a different kind of battle than any corporate boardroom had ever demanded. The drive back to his modest hotel took him through neighborhoods that reminded him of his own childhood, places where dreams went to struggle and sometimes die, where good people worked hard for wages that barely covered rent, where the promise of America felt more like a cruel joke than a birthright. Jack had escaped these streets through a combination of luck, determination, and the sacrifices of people who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Now, sitting in traffic at a red light, he realized that escape had never been the point. The point was coming back with the power to change things. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Board meeting moved to Thursday. Financial projections looking good. Hope your vacation is relaxing. Vacation. If only she knew." Jack typed back a brief acknowledgement and tucked the phone away. Tomorrow would be day 2 of his investigation, and he suspected Mark Dawson was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. The next morning arrived gray and humid, Houston's summer heat already building despite the early hour. Jack dressed carefully in the same work clothes from the day before, adding a baseball cap from a local construction company he'd picked up at a gas station. In the mirror, he looked like any other working man heading to a job that paid by the hour and demanded everything in return. The drive to Hale's Burgers took 15 minutes through streets lined with auto repair shops, check cashing stores, and apartment complexes that had seen better decades. Jack parked in the same spot as yesterday and sat for a moment, watching the morning shift arrive. Maria walked from a bus stop 3 blocks away, her uniform crisp despite the early hour, her posture straight, despite whatever burdens she carried. The restaurant was busier during the breakfast rush, filled with people grabbing coffee and breakfast sandwiches before work. Jack ordered black coffee and a breakfast burrito, noting how Mark's behavior shifted based on the racial composition of the crowd. When the dining room was predominantly white office workers and suburban commuters passing through, Mark was professional, almost obsequious. As the crowd shifted to include more people of color shift workers, service employees, students, his demeanor hardened into something uglier. Jack found a corner booth where he could observe without drawing attention, sipping his coffee and pretending to scroll through his phone while actually recording audio of the interactions around him. What he heard made his stomach turn. "These people always want something for nothing," Mark was saying to another employee, his voice low but not low enough. "Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. That's why we have to stay firm on policies." The policies Mark referenced seemed to exist only in his imagination, different standards for different customers. Arbitrary rules applied based on skin color and accent and perceived economic status. Jack watched a young black father get questioned about his credit card, while a white businessman using an identical card was processed without comment. He saw Mark pocket a $5 tip left for Maria while she was in the back retrieving supplies. Each incident was small enough to dismiss individually, but collectively, they painted a picture of systematic oppression that made Jack's hands clench around his coffee cup. This wasn't just poor management. It was weaponized discrimination, designed to humiliate and demoralize the very people his company was supposed to serve and employ. When Maria's shift supervisor, an older Latina woman named Carmen, arrived for the day shift, Jack watched the dynamic change again. Carmen moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile environments through competence and invisibility. But even she wasn't immune to Mark's casual cruelty. "Carmen, that uniform looks wrinkled," Mark announced, loudly enough for customers to hear. "How are we supposed to maintain standards if our employees can't even dress properly?" Carmen's uniform was pristine, pressed and spotless, but she apologized anyway, her voice steady despite the humiliation. Jack recognized the survival strategy: deflect, apologize, endure. He'd employed it himself more times than he cared to remember before success gave him the armor of respectability. As the morning progressed, Jack began to see the larger pattern. Mark wasn't just a racist manager, he was the enforcer for a system that extended up the chain of command. When Regional Director Ronald Vickers called, Mark's entire demeanor shifted to obsequious compliance. "Yes, sir, Mr. Vickers." "Absolutely, sir. We're running a tight ship here." The phone call lasted 10 minutes, and Jack caught fragments that chilled him to the bone. References to keeping certain elements in line, discussion of acceptable losses in employee turnover, and casual dismissal of customer complaints from those neighborhoods. When Mark hung up, he was energized with the confidence of someone whose authority had been reinforced from above. He gathered the morning staff for what he called a performance review, but which sounded more like a verbal assault. "I've been watching, and I'm seeing some problems," Mark began, his eyes moving from employee to employee like a general reviewing troops. "Slow service, poor attitudes, and way too much chit-chat with customers. This isn't a social club. This is a business." His gaze lingered on Maria and Carmen, the weight of his disapproval heavy and deliberate. "Some of you seem to think you can coast by on sympathy and sob stories, but this company demands excellence from everyone, regardless of background." The coded language was masterful in its cruelty, never explicit enough to trigger a lawsuit, but clear enough to convey the message. "We know who you are, and we know you're expendable." Jack felt his phone vibrate with a text from an unknown number. "Sir, this is Maria from Hales. I saw you yesterday and today. If you're a reporter or someone who can help, please meet me at the McDonald's down the street during my break at 2 p.m. These people are destroying us." The message hit Jack like a physical blow. Maria had recognized something in him, some quality that suggested he might be more than just another customer. Her courage in reaching out, despite the risk, reminded him why he'd built this company in the first place. Jack deleted the message and finished his coffee, his mind already working through the implications. If Maria was willing to talk, others might be too. But first, he needed to understand exactly how deep this corruption went and who was protecting it. He spent the rest of the morning at a nearby internet cafe, using public computers to research Mark Dawson and Ronald Vickers. What he found exceeded his worst expectations. Mark had a history of discrimination complaints at previous jobs, all mysteriously dismissed or settled quietly. Ronald had been promoted despite multiple HR investigations, his personnel file reading like a masterclass in corporate cover-ups. More disturbing was the pattern across other Houston-area franchises under Ronald's supervision. Employee turnover rates that defied industry standards, customer complaint patterns that mapped directly to demographic data, and financial irregularities that suggested systematic wage theft on a massive scale. At 1:45 p.m., Jack walked to the McDonald's down the street and ordered a coffee he didn't want. At exactly 2 p.m., Maria appeared, her uniform replaced by jeans and a t-shirt that made her look even younger. She spotted him immediately and approached with the cautious courage of someone who'd learned to be afraid but refused to be silent. "You're not just a customer," she said without preamble, sliding into the booth across from him. "I can tell. You watch everything, you take notes, and yesterday when Mr. Dawson was being himself, you didn't look surprised. You looked angry." Jack studied her face, seeing intelligence and desperation in equal measure. "Why did you reach out to me?" "Because I'm tired of being afraid," Maria said simply. "Because my little sister just got hired there, and I can't watch her go through what I've been going through. Because someone needs to know what's really happening." For the next 30 minutes, Maria painted a picture of workplace abuse that staggered Jack even after everything he'd witnessed. Systematic wage theft through manipulated time clocks, sexual harassment disguised as performance feedback, and a culture of fear maintained through threats of immigration raids and police calls. "Mr. Dawson keeps a list," Maria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Names of employees he calls troublemakers. Anyone who complains, anyone who stands up for themselves, anyone who tries to organize." Those people get impossible schedules, write-ups for made-up violations, and eventually they quit or get fired. "What about Mr. Vickers?" Jack asked. Maria's expression darkened. "He's worse. At least Mr. Dawson is obvious about his hatred. Mr. Vickers is smart about it. He knows exactly how to stay just inside the law while making our lives hell. He's the one who taught Mr. Dawson how to steal our tips without leaving evidence." Jack felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just isolated misconduct. It was a sophisticated operation designed to extract maximum profit from vulnerable workers while maintaining plausible deniability for corporate leadership. "I need proof," Jack said. "Documentation, recordings, anything that would hold up in court." Maria nodded and reached into her purse, pulling out a battered smartphone. "I've been recording conversations for 3 months, and I'm not the only one. Carmen has photos of the tip jar being emptied, and Luis has copies of the altered timesheets." She scrolled through her phone, showing Jack video after video of Mark's verbal abuse, audio recordings of discriminatory comments, and photos of policy violations that painted a damning picture of systematic corruption. "Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" Jack asked. Maria's laugh was bitter. "With what money? What lawyer? And who would believe us against a big company? We're just fast food workers. Disposable." The pain in her voice cut through Jack like a blade. These were his employees, people whose livelihoods depended on the company he'd built, and they'd been abandoned by every system that was supposed to protect them. "If someone could guarantee your safety," Jack said carefully, "and ensure that the people responsible faced real consequences, would you be willing to go on record with your allegations?" Maria's eyes searched his face, looking for some sign of deception or false hope. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded slowly. "Yes, and I know at least 6 others who would too. We're tired of being afraid." Jack felt something shift inside him. A familiar sensation from his early days as an entrepreneur when a risky decision suddenly clarified into absolute certainty. Tomorrow, he would return to Hale's Burgers one final time. But tonight, he had phone calls to make and lawyers to brief. The game was about to change, and Mark Dawson had no idea what was coming. Wednesday morning brought thunderclouds and humidity thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack dressed in the same work clothes for the 3rd consecutive day. But this time he carried something extra, a small digital recorder in his shirt pocket and a phone number for Sarah Williams programmed into his speed dial. The breakfast rush was in full swing when he arrived, and the tension in the restaurant was immediately apparent. Maria looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a sleepless night. Carmen moved with the rigid efficiency of someone operating under extreme stress, and even the kitchen staff seemed subdued. Mark prowled the dining room like a predator, his aggressive energy amplified by something Jack couldn't quite identify. When Ronald Vickers walked through the front door at 8:30 a.m., the missing piece clicked into place. This wasn't a routine visit. It was a coordinated operation. Ronald commanded attention the moment he entered, his expensive suit and polished demeanor marking him as management even before he spoke. He was a handsome man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that corporate America rewarded generously. But Jack, watching from his corner booth, saw something else, the cold calculation of a predator who'd learned to hunt in boardrooms and HR departments. "Good morning, team," Ronald announced, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician. "I'm here for one of my routine quality assessments. I trust everyone is maintaining our high standards." The response from the staff was immediate and telling. Shoulders tensed, movements became more careful, conversations stopped. Even customers seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, the way prey animals recognize the presence of a predator. Jack sipped his coffee and watched Ronald begin his assessment, which quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister. The regional director moved through the restaurant like a general inspecting troops, his comments designed to intimidate rather than improve performance. "Maria, that smile needs to be brighter," he said, his tone suggesting disappointment. "Our customers deserve enthusiasm, not whatever that expression is supposed to be." "Carmen, I'm seeing some inefficiency in your prep work. Are you sure you're the right fit for this position?" Each comment was carefully calibrated to undermine confidence while maintaining plausible deniability. To a casual observer, Ronald might appear to be a dedicated manager pushing for excellence. To Jack, who'd spent decades learning to read corporate power plays, it was psychological warfare dressed up as performance management. The pattern became clear as Ronald made his rounds. Employees of color received harsh criticism for minor infractions, while white employees were praised for identical behavior. The double standard was so systematic it had to be intentional, a deliberate strategy to create a hostile environment that would drive away undesirable workers. When Ronald approached Jack's table, the predator's attention sharpened with sudden focus. "Good morning, sir. I don't believe we've met. I'm Ronald Vickers, regional director for this location." Jack looked up from his phone with the expression of mild confusion he'd perfected over decades of navigating predominantly white spaces. "Just having breakfast. Good coffee." "Excellent to hear," Ronald said, but his eyes were cataloging details: Jack's appearance, his table location, the fact that he'd been there for nearly an hour. "Are you from the neighborhood?" The question was casual, but Jack recognized the subtext. "What are you doing here? Do you belong? Are you a threat?" "Visiting Houston for work," Jack replied, matching Ronald's casual tone. "Heard good things about this place." Ronald's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wonderful. We pride ourselves on serving all members of the community." The emphasis on all carried a weight that suggested the opposite sentiment. As Ronald moved away, Jack caught Maria watching the interaction with barely concealed anxiety. She understood better than anyone what it meant when management started paying attention to specific customers, especially customers who looked like him. The situation escalated when a family of four, two black parents with teenage children, entered the restaurant and joined the line. Jack watched Ronald's demeanor shift subtly, his attention focusing on the new arrivals with the intensity of a surveillance camera. "Mark," Ronald said quietly, but not quietly enough, "make sure we're following all our verification procedures today." Mark nodded with the enthusiasm of a student eager to please a demanding teacher. When the family reached the counter, the harassment began immediately. "I'll need to see ID for that credit card," Mark announced, despite the fact that the previous three customers had used cards without being questioned. The father, a man about Jack's age wearing scrubs that suggested he worked in healthcare, produced his license with the weary compliance of someone who'd faced this routine countless times. "This card's pretty new," Mark observed, examining the plastic like he was a forensic expert. "Mind if I run it through our verification system?" "That's not necessary," the man said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It's a valid card from a major bank." "Company policy," Mark replied, echoing the same lie he'd told Jack days earlier. "We have to be careful about fraud." Jack felt his jaw clench as he watched the family endure the humiliation, their teenage children's faces burning with embarrassment as other customers stared. The father's wife placed a calming hand on his arm, a gesture Jack recognized as the universal signal for, "Don't make this worse." Ronald watched the entire exchange with the satisfaction of a director observing a perfectly executed scene. This wasn't random harassment. It was a deliberate performance designed to send a message to other customers who looked like the family, like Jack, like anyone who might consider this restaurant a welcoming space. When Mark finally processed the card, which worked perfectly, as everyone knew it would, the family ordered quickly and moved to a table near the back, their body language radiating the exhaustion of people who just survived another small trauma in a lifetime full of them. Jack pulled out his phone and began typing what appeared to be a text message, but was actually detailed notes about everything he'd witnessed. Times, quotes, behaviors, evidence that would be crucial in the legal proceedings he was already planning. "Excuse me, sir." Jack looked up to find Ronald standing beside his table again, this time flanked by Mark. The regional director's expression had shifted from casual friendliness to something harder and more focused. "Is there a problem?" Jack asked, his voice level despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "That's what we're trying to determine," Ronald said, pulling out the chair across from Jack and sitting down uninvited. "You've been here for quite a while, and several of my employees have mentioned that you seem to be observing rather than eating." Mark nodded eagerly. "He was here yesterday too, and Monday." Same table, just watching and typing on his phone. Jack felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a box constructed from other people's assumptions and prejudices. In his corporate life, his presence commanded automatic respect. Here, stripped of those markers of success, he was just another black man whose behavior required explanation and justification. "I like the coffee," Jack said simply, "and I'm in town for a few days with time to kill." "What kind of work brings you to Houston?" Ronald asked, his tone suggesting the question wasn't optional. Jack had prepared for this moment, crafting a cover story that would seem plausible without inviting deeper investigation. "Construction consulting, reviewing sites for a company based in Chicago." The mention of Chicago sparked something in Ronald's eyes, a flicker of recognition or concern that was quickly suppressed. Jack filed the reaction away for later analysis. "Construction," Ronald repeated. "That's interesting. What company?" The questions were coming faster now, each one designed to probe for inconsistencies in Jack's story. It was an interrogation disguised as casual conversation, the kind of corporate intimidation tactic that Jack had seen deployed against workers who asked too many questions about their rights. "Listen," Jack said, matching Ronald's casual tone while projecting calm authority. "I'm just trying to enjoy my breakfast. Is there some reason I can't sit here and drink coffee like any other customer?" Ronald's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course not. It's just that we've had some issues lately with people who aren't genuine customers. Scammers, activists, people looking to cause trouble for our business." The threat was clear, even though the words remained technically polite. "You don't belong here. We're watching you. Leave now or face consequences." Jack felt something shift inside him, a familiar sensation from boardroom battles when opponents revealed their true nature through overconfidence. Ronald thought he was dealing with just another troublemaker who could be intimidated into silence. He had no idea he was threatening the man who signed his paychecks. "I understand your concern," Jack said, his voice carrying a weight that made both men unconsciously lean back. "But I think you might be misunderstanding the situation here." Before Ronald could respond, Jack's phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Williams' number, a coincidence that felt almost supernatural in its timing. Jack answered with a calm professionalism that immediately shifted the dynamic at the table. "Jack Morgan speaking," he said, and watched both Mark and Ronald freeze as his full name registered. Sarah's voice was clear enough to be heard across the table. "Jack, I need to brief you on the Houston situation before your meeting with the board tomorrow. Are you somewhere private?" "Actually," Jack said, his eyes locked on Ronald's increasingly pale face, "I'm in the middle of some field research. Can you hold for just a moment?" He muted the phone and looked across the table at two men who were beginning to understand that their world was about to change in ways they couldn't imagine. "Gentlemen," Jack said quietly, "I think we need to have a different kind of conversation." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shifting power dynamics. Mark looked confused, his limited imagination struggling to process what was happening. But Ronald understood immediately, his corporate instincts recognizing the moment when a predator realizes he's become prey. "Mr. Morgan," Ronald said, his voice carefully controlled, "I had no idea you were conducting an inspection. If you'd identified yourself, would that have changed how you treated that family?" Jack interrupted, gesturing toward the table where the healthcare worker sat with his humiliated children. "Would Maria and Carmen suddenly have received the respect they deserve as human beings?" Ronald's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Mark looked back and forth between them, finally beginning to grasp that the customer he'd been harassing for 3 days was somehow connected to corporate management. Jack unmuted his phone. "Sarah, I need you to conference in legal and HR immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate intervention." "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice shifting to the crisp efficiency of crisis management. "Should I alert the board?" "Definitely." "And Sarah?" "I need a full audit of every location under Ronald Vickers' supervision. Employment records, customer complaints, financial irregularities, everything. And I want it started today." Jack could hear Sarah's fingers flying across her keyboard. "Consider it done." "Jack, are you safe? Do you need security?" The question hung in the air like smoke, drawing stares from other customers who were beginning to sense that something significant was happening at the corner table. "I'm fine," Jack said, his eyes never leaving Ronald's face. "But I think Mr. Vickers and Mr. Dawson might want to start thinking about their career options." Mark finally found his voice. "Wait, who are you exactly?" Jack stood slowly, his movement drawing the attention of everyone in the restaurant. Maria had emerged from behind the counter, her eyes wide with dawning understanding. Carmen stood frozen by the coffee machine, a pot trembling in her hands. "I'm Jack Morgan," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I founded Hale's Burgers 15 years ago. I own this restaurant and 846 others just like it." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of refrigerators and the distant sound of traffic on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Then, like a dam breaking, the implications began to cascade through the room. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, tears of relief and vindication streaming down her face. Carmen set down her coffee pot and began to smile for the first time in months. Other employees emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the electricity in the air and the sense that something fundamental had just shifted. Ronald sat motionless, his corporate composure cracking like ice under spring sunlight. Mark had gone pale, his breathing shallow as he calculated the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Mr. Morgan," Ronald began, his voice carrying the desperate tone of a man trying to defuse a bomb with words. "If there have been any misunderstandings, misunderstandings, ? Jack's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "Is that what you call systematic discrimination against my employees and customers? Is that what you call stealing tips from workers who can barely afford rent?" Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through the videos and audio recordings that Maria and others had provided. "I have documentation of dozens of policy violations, discriminatory practices, and what appears to be organized wage theft. Would you like to hear some examples?" Ronald's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. Mark looked like he might vomit, his earlier arrogance replaced by the dawning understanding of consequences. "Furthermore," Jack continued, his voice growing stronger, "I've spent 3 days in this restaurant witnessing behavior that violates every principle this company was founded on. Employees intimidated, customers humiliated, and a culture of fear that makes me ashamed to have my name on the sign outside." He turned to address the room, speaking directly to employees who had suffered in silence for too long. "Effective immediately, Mark Dawson is terminated from employment with Hale's Burgers and will never be eligible for rehire with this company or any of our franchisees." Mark's knees buckled, and he grabbed the table for support. "Please, Mr. Morgan, I have a family. I need this job." "You should have thought about that before you decided to abuse the people who work for this company," Jack replied, his voice carrying no sympathy for the man who had shown none to others. He turned to Ronald, who had managed to recover some composure, but still looked like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "Mr. Vickers, you're suspended pending a full investigation into your management practices and the culture you fostered in this region. Security will escort you from the premises within the hour." Ronald tried one last desperate play. "Jack, you're making a mistake. These people, they're trying to manipulate you with sob stories and manufactured outrage. I've been protecting the company's interests by creating a hostile work environment, by systematic discrimination against customers and employees, by allowing theft and harassment to flourish under your supervision." Jack's voice rose enough to carry to every corner of the restaurant. "If that's your definition of protecting company interests, then we have fundamentally different values." Jack pulled out his phone again and placed a call that connected immediately. "This is Jack Morgan. I need a team from corporate HR in Houston today. Full investigation, employee interviews, and immediate implementation of corrective measures." He paused, listening. "Yes, I'm serious. And contact our legal department. We may have criminal referrals to make." As he spoke, Jack watched the faces around the room transform. Maria was crying openly now, but her tears had shifted from despair to relief. Carmen was nodding to herself like a person whose faith in justice had been unexpectedly restored. Even customers who had witnessed the morning's events seemed to sense that they were watching something significant unfold. "One more thing," Jack said, addressing the room again. "Maria, Carmen, and anyone else who suffered under this management will receive full compensation for stolen wages and tips. We're implementing an anonymous reporting system with direct access to corporate headquarters, and this location will be temporarily closed for complete retraining on diversity, inclusion, and respect for all employees and customers." The transformation was immediate and profound. Employees who had been cowering under Mark's reign began to stand straighter, their voices returning as the atmosphere of fear dissipated like smoke in fresh air. Ronald made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Jack, if we could discuss this privately." "The time for private discussions was when you chose to create this toxic environment," Jack replied. "Your employees tried to report these problems through proper channels. They were ignored, threatened, and retaliated against. The only reason we're having this conversation is because they found the courage to document your failures despite the risk to themselves." Jack turned to Maria, who was still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "You saved this company from a lawsuit that would have cost millions and, more importantly, damaged our reputation with the communities we serve. I want to personally thank you for your courage." Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Jack assured her, "and it's just the beginning. We're going to make sure this never happens again anywhere in our system." As if summoned by the drama, Jack's phone rang again. Sarah Williams's name appeared on the screen, and this time her voice carried the urgency of someone coordinating a major corporate response. "Jack, I have the board on conference, legal standing by, and HR teams mobilizing for Houston. What's your immediate priority?" "Employee safety and support," Jack replied without hesitation. "Anyone who experienced retaliation or discrimination gets immediate assistance. Then we audit every location in this region and any other areas where similar patterns might exist. Consider it done." The story is already breaking on social media. Someone recorded part of your confrontation with the managers. Justice at Hales is trending. Jack looked around and spotted several customers holding phones, their screens showing the recording and sharing functions that had become as natural as breathing for the social media generation. The reckoning he'd initiated was already spreading beyond the walls of this single restaurant. "Good," he said. "Transparency is exactly what we need right now." Ronald stood abruptly, his face flushed with the desperate anger of a man whose carefully constructed power structure was collapsing. "This is harassment," he declared, his voice cracking with strain. "I'll file complaints with corporate, with the labor board, with who?" Jack asked calmly. "I am corporate, and I encourage you to file whatever complaints you want. The documentation of your behavior will speak for itself." Mark, who had been silent since his termination, suddenly found his voice. "This isn't fair! You can't just destroy our lives because of a few complaints from disgruntled employees." The reaction from the room was immediate and powerful. Maria stepped forward, her earlier timidity replaced by righteous anger. "A few complaints," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet restaurant. "You stole our tips every single day. You changed our time cards to avoid paying overtime. You threatened to call ICE on anyone who spoke up about unsafe working conditions." Carmen joined her, speaking with the authority of someone who had endured months of systematic abuse. "You made us work when we were sick, because you said we couldn't afford to miss shifts. You scheduled us for impossible hours and then wrote us up when we couldn't meet your demands." Other employees began to speak up, their voices creating a chorus of testimony that painted a devastating picture of workplace abuse. Each story added another layer to the case Jack was building, not just for corporate discipline, but for potential criminal prosecution. As the employees shared their experiences, Jack noticed something profound happening in the dining room. Customers who had witnessed the discrimination were nodding in recognition, some approaching employees to offer support and contact information for potential legal proceedings. The young black father who had been humiliated at the counter approached Jack directly. "Sir, I want to thank you for what you just did. My kids needed to see that sometimes justice actually happens." The comment hit Jack like a physical blow, reminding him of his own children and the world he wanted them to inherit. "Every child deserves to grow up believing that fairness is possible," he replied. Today was a small step in that direction. Within an hour, the restaurant had transformed into something resembling a community meeting, with employees sharing stories, customers offering support, and Jack coordinating with corporate headquarters to ensure immediate assistance for everyone who had suffered under the previous management. Sarah Williams arrived via video call on a tablet that one of the regional HR representatives had brought, her presence adding the authority of corporate backing to Jack's promises of reform. "We're implementing immediate changes across all locations," she announced to the assembled group. "Anonymous reporting systems, independent ombudsman oversight, and regular audits to prevent this situation from recurring elsewhere." Ronald, who had been standing in the corner like a defendant awaiting sentencing, finally accepted the reality of his situation and left the restaurant escorted by security. Mark had already gathered his personal items and departed, his final glance back carrying the bitter recognition of consequences, finally catching up with choices. As the immediate crisis settled into organized response, Jack found himself standing at the counter where this all began, looking at the menu board that displayed prices he'd approved, policies he'd implemented, and values he'd hoped would guide every interaction in every restaurant bearing his name. Maria approached him, her earlier tears replaced by a composure that suggested the weight of months of fear had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "I need you to know that speaking up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but staying silent was killing me inside." Jack nodded, understanding the courage it had taken for her to reach out to a stranger in a McDonald's with nothing but faith that someone, somewhere, might care enough to listen. "You saved this company from becoming something I never intended it to be," he told her. "You reminded me why I started this business in the first place." Carmen joined them, her bearing reflecting the dignity that no amount of workplace harassment had been able to destroy. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild," Jack said. "We create the kind of workplace where your children would be proud to work, where every customer feels welcome, and where speaking up about problems is rewarded instead of punished." The afternoon dissolved into a blur of interviews, documentation, and coordination with legal and HR teams who descended on the restaurant like investigators at a crime scene. Each conversation revealed new layers of systematic abuse that extended far beyond what Jack had initially suspected. By evening, the scope of the investigation had expanded to include 12 other restaurants in the region, with preliminary evidence suggesting that Ronald's management style was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern that had been allowed to flourish through corporate negligence. As Jack finally prepared to leave the restaurant, he took one last look around the dining room, where so much had changed in the space of a single morning. The atmosphere felt different, lighter somehow, as if a poisonous gas had been vented from the air system. Maria was training a temporary manager who had been dispatched from corporate headquarters, her confidence growing visibly as she realized that her voice now carried the weight of authority rather than the fear of retaliation. "Thank you," she said as Jack prepared to leave. "Not just for today, but for creating a company that was worth fighting for." The comment stayed with Jack as he drove back to his hotel through the Houston evening, past the same neighborhoods and the same struggles he'd observed days earlier, but with a renewed sense of purpose that felt like redemption. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from corporate headquarters, news alerts about the viral videos, and messages from employees at other locations who had found the courage to report similar problems. The reckoning he'd initiated was spreading like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. That night, Jack sat in his hotel room and began writing a company-wide memo that would be distributed to every Hales Burgers location in America. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as he found language to express the transformation he intended to create. "To every employee, manager, and franchisee in the Hales Burgers family," he began, "today I learned that we have failed to live up to the values we claim to represent. That failure ends now." The memo went on to detail new policies, oversight mechanisms, and cultural changes designed to ensure that what happened in Houston could never be repeated. But more than policy changes, it was a declaration of war against the systems of oppression that had been allowed to flourish in his absence. As Jack finished writing and prepared to send the memo that would reach thousands of employees across the country, he realized that this moment represented more than corporate reform. It was a return to the principles that had driven him to build the company in the first place, the belief that business could be a force for justice, opportunity, and dignity for everyone willing to work hard and be treated fairly. The young man who had faced discrimination in a Detroit fast food restaurant 40 years earlier had finally found the power to ensure that no one else would have to endure that experience in silence and alone. But even as satisfaction settled over him like a comfortable blanket, Jack knew that today's victory was just the beginning. Real change would require sustained effort, constant vigilance, and the kind of cultural transformation that could only happen when people at every level of an organization decided that justice was more important than comfort. Tomorrow, he would return to Chicago and begin the long work of turning crisis into opportunity, punishment into prevention, and a company's worst moment into its finest hour. The memo was sent at 11:47 p.m. Central Time, reaching every Hales Burgers location as the night shift took over from the day shift, carrying with it the promise that dawn was breaking on a new era for the company and everyone whose lives it touched. 3 months later, Jack stood before a congressional subcommittee investigating workplace discrimination in the fast food industry, his testimony serving as a case study in corporate accountability and the power of individual courage to create systemic change. Maria sat in the gallery behind him, now serving as the regional employee advocate for Hales Burgers, her experience having transformed her from victim to voice for workers across the industry. Carmen had been promoted to assistant manager and was completing her business degree with tuition assistance from the company's newly established education fund. Ronald Vickers faced criminal charges for wage theft and was defending himself in multiple civil rights lawsuits. Mark Dawson had been unable to find employment in food service and was working construction. His professional reputation destroyed by the viral videos that continued to circulate as cautionary tales about the consequences of workplace abuse. The lesson we learned, Jack told the committee, is that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. It's complicity. When we allow discrimination to flourish in our workplaces, we're not just harming individual employees, we're poisoning the very foundations of the American dream. His words were broadcast live on CSPAN and shared millions of times on social media, reaching far beyond the restaurant industry to inspire workers in every sector who faced similar challenges. But for Jack, the real measure of success wasn't in congressional testimony or corporate awards. It was in the text messages he received from employees like Maria, sharing stories of promotion, education, and opportunity that would have been impossible under the old system. It was in the customer letters that arrived daily, thanking him for creating restaurants where families of all backgrounds felt welcome and respected. Most importantly, it was in the knowledge that his children would inherit a company that lived up to its values, rather than one that merely claimed them. Change, Jack had learned, doesn't happen in boardrooms or through policy statements. It happens when individual people find the courage to speak truth to power, and when those in power choose to listen rather than defend. The revolution at Hale's Burgers had begun with one woman's tears and one man's decision to stop pretending he didn't see the injustice happening in his own name. It continued every day that employees felt safe to speak up, customers felt welcomed regardless of their background, and leaders chose courage over comfort. In the end, that was the only revolution that mattered, the one that happened one interaction, one decision, one moment of moral clarity at a time. The fluorescent lights still hummed in the Houston restaurant where it all began, but now they illuminated something different. A workplace where dignity was non-negotiable, where opportunity was distributed fairly, and where the promise of America felt within reach for everyone willing to work for it. Jack's journey from silence to action had become a template for transformation that extended far beyond the walls of any single restaurant. It proved that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they refused to accept that injustice was simply the price of doing business. And in a world that often felt divided by forces beyond individual control, it offered hope that unity could be rebuilt one honest conversation, one fair decision, one act of courage at a time. The revolution wasn't televised. It was lived, one shift at a time, by people who decided that they deserved better and were willing to fight for it. That, in the end, was the most powerful force in America, the belief that tomorrow could be different if enough people decided to make it so.